without much further ado, your book is called The Culture Transplant, and the subtitle is How Migrants Make the Economies They Move to a Lot Like the Ones They Left. So without me butchering your thesis, let's begin with a brief outline of what it is that you are putting forward in that book.
Yeah, part of my one way to sum up my story is that the world hasn't changed that much since 1500 economically. Once you keep track of who moved where. So if you look in the old world, if you think about 1500, I picked 1500 because that's what researchers look at, and it's before Columbus and the European migrations overturned population movements completely. So if you look at just the order in the old world, in 1500, the two most economically prosperous places were Western Europe and Eastern Asia. The Islamic world had already fallen into decline for a couple of centuries. Sub-Saharan Africa was substantially less technologically sophisticated, although the areas of close to the Sahel, just below the Saharan desert, those areas were relatively within Sub-Saharan Africa more sophisticated. And what happens if we look at the old world and compare 1500 to today, we'd say the rank order is about the same. Technological sophistication in 1500 in the old world roughly predicts economic productivity, income per person, prosperity, lifespan, whatever today. So what is old is new again in that respect. Things were jumbled a bit in 1700s, 1800s, and early part of the 1900s. But what is old is new again in the old world. And then if we look at the new world, the world ran a series of horrifying experiments, moving populations. And that lets us test the theory, what matters more for prosperity, geography or people? And as anyone who just knows anything about the world knows, the parts of the Americas that are the most prosperous are the places that have had the most European migration on average. Those also tend to be the places that are furthest from the equator, right? So Canada, the US are, of course, quite economically productive, quite rich countries. But also, if we look at the southern part of South America, the highest income parts of South America are the parts that are, again, furthest from the equator: Chile, Uruguay, Argentina. You might think, well, maybe that just fits this theory that it's geography again. Just being close to Santa Claus or being close to the penguins makes you productive. The thing is, in the old world, in the new world, the most productive places before Columbus were actually closest to the equator. So the importance of geography completely flipped between pre-Columbus and post-Columbus. So the European migrations offer a horrifying natural experiment that we can use to learn something about whether people matter more than places, but also the peaceful migrations of people across from China to the rest of Southeast Asia offer another experiment. The migration of folks from China to places like Singapore, Malaysia, the Philippines offer us a new experiment, which lets us look at whether migrants can peacefully, by migrating to a new place, change the economy. And indeed, they do. The term that's widely used in academia is that Chinese migrants across Southeast Asia are market-dominant minorities. They did not assimilate to the lower productivity of the places they moved to. So full assimilation, as we know in so many ways, is a myth. And in particular, the countries that have had the most Chinese migration since 1500 are actually the most productive and seem to have the best institutions by normal measures. A pretty good predictor of whether a place has something like liberalism or neoliberalism across Southeast Asia is percentage of migrants from China. So Singapore at the top of the list, Hong Kong and Macau, depending on how one counts that. Malaysia is sort of in the middle. It's about 20-30% Chinese of Chinese descent. Market dominant minority there that gets persecuted, but nevertheless, they make important contributions to the economy. Then you look at a place like the Philippines, where Chinese minorities are very small, but economically dominant community within the Philippines. And 4% just looks like it's not quite enough to completely change the institutions of the country. So if I wanted to give some advice to a lot of poor countries in the world, they should be more like Malaysia, and they should welcome sizable amounts of migration from China so that they can have these market dominant minorities move in, improve the culture and the economy over the course of a couple of generations, become much more productive 50, 60 years from now. Long-term investment, I think it's worth doing. And it's a reminder that migration can be used as a way to improve your nation's institutions if you're choosing wisely.
Interesting. So how about the and you've touched on it, you've implied it. Where do you typically find the immigrants that make the least economic contributions to a society? So China seems to be right up there, and you include tables upon tables within your book of showing here's the economic contribution. So which parts of the world typically provide those kind of migrants?
Well, so yeah, as you would imagine, I try to focus on the positive to give people a sort of way to imagine a good outcome. The answer there is that again, we look at the way things were before 1500, and we say migration from the communities that were least successful, least technologically sophisticated before 1500 would be those that are on the weaker side today. And the two big groups that one would look at would, if you look at the data assembled by Coleman, Easterly, and Gong in this really nice 2010 paper, you would have to say that it'd be people that Native Americans on average have the least technological sophistication from that age 1500 score, that year 1500 score. And if we look within the New World, the countries that have the highest proportion of Native American populations closer to the equator, as it happens, tend to have the biggest economic problems. Similarly, again, I have to emphasize, this is important to point out in this line of work, there are always exceptions, and much migration is selective, which is well worth pointing out. But the migrations from Africa to the New World have not succeeded as culture transplants that led to a lot of productivity, right? So if one looks across, if one looks within the U.S., Alex Naraste and Ryan Murphy have done some work. Naraste is at the Cato Institute, and he showed that, for instance, within the United States, that migration of folks with lower deep root scores, which in the U.S. case is substantially from sub-Saharan Africa, those places tend to have lower incomes today and have lower freedom scores, lower measures of institutional quality, higher measures of corruption. So these are things that are just true on average. There are many exceptions, but those are the norms as reported by researchers in the field. So
you used the term selective immigration before, and I know in the book you pull out how there are some countries like Australia, New Zealand, and up until relatively recently Canada, who've used very selective immigration policies. And when you look at their economic performance, they seem to be booming, I suppose. I guess there are other things. They've got natural resources.
Have a lot of things going on, right? There's all this,
lots of things going on. And then we've got the US, the UK, the French, and the Italians who have been less selective. And being a Brit, we know that there has been a mass immigration policy since 1997, which has only ramped up, and we're now importing 1.2 million per year the last 2 years, and then subtract 500,000 current British residents out of that equation, and we're very unselective. So I don't know the exact numbers, but we definitely have tens of thousands of Chinese. We have also many thousands Indians, Pakistanis, and lots from sub-Saharan Africa too. I suppose my question to you then is, if there's such a long lag, multi-generational, consistent economic outcome depending on where people are coming from, is for a country like Britain, for France, this unselective immigration, how long is that impact going to be on both their economy and their institutions? And do you effectively lock yourself into that kind of economic fate by the people that you bring in?
So it's, there's a form of selection that you mentioned there that's really important for me to dive into. So my first book, Hive Mind, was about IQ, national average IQ. And so just using test scores as a proxy of a person's productivity. My third book, The Culture Transplant, is about using more or less the nation you came from as a proxy for your productivity. So a lot of selective migration stories that people talk about really are about using education as some kind of proxy, or educational potential as some kind of proxy for being selective, right? Well, in the British case, my understanding is a lot of folks are coming in through university, right? They're coming in through university admissions. And so that's at least one screen that gets one, that makes sure that you're not likely to have people who are in the bottom half of, say, their country of origin's distribution, right? So it's a form of selection that matters a lot. So, but let me take your case as a hypothetical, right? I've in 10% Less Democracy, my second book, I actually looked at British GSCE passage rates. Did I get the acronym right there? I said it quickly.
GSCE? I don't know what. Oh, GCSE.
GCSE. I got it backwards. I say it fast. Yeah.
Yeah.
And within Britain, all of the well-studied migrant ethnic groups that are in the British data all have at least a 70% passage rate on that exam, right? That is not, 70% isn't perfect, but it's well over half, right? So my first answer to your question is that by the standards of the possible, British immigration is kind of selective, right? When I've been checking the data lately on this to prep for this, the usual estimate for the UK is that migrants have higher education levels and earn more than the average person in the British population. Some of that could be a London effect, right? Of course. But within that group, as you know, but I should say for the audience, migrants from China and India tend to be obviously above the UK average, and migrants from Pakistan and Bangladesh tend to be below the UK average, right? So, my understanding is that sub-Saharan African migration to the UK is fairly selective, so they might actually be above the UK average. I'm open to further data on that question. But if we look at the two groups that are the two categories, India and China above average and Pakistan and Bangladesh below average in terms of educational attainment, it's reasonable to expect that that'll be intergenerationally persistent. Some of this stuff has already been studied in the second generation. And you are sort of, a nation is setting itself up for a future with that, right? Because these outcomes tend to be intergenerationally persistent. We don't know a lot about how to fix this. We don't know about how to create intergenerational equality where there was intergenerational inequality beforehand. So that's a hand you're stuck with. And so it's safe to predict that basically party coalitions will be having to decide within the UK, like which parties are going to fight for which ethnic groups as part of their voting coalition. And so it'll be shaping politics for generations to come. The general story of my research would be that if you're bringing in folks from countries that have a lot of ancestral technological sophistication, what we call a strong deep root score informally, that's going to help you in the very long run. There'll be some social conflict. There'll be some bickering. There may be ethnic frictions that are important. But bringing in folks from the highest performing countries using these era 1500 scores is a good way to set your future on a better path. And bringing in folks from countries where the scores are lower means you're just going to have some difficulties in the foreseeable future.